I'm going to start this video the way that my daughters would start it if they were making their little fake YouTube videos, because they don't actually have a YouTube account. They just like to pretend. And they would start it like this. Hey guys, this is Samantha. I'm here to do a video today about a book that I wrote like 4 years ago, and we're going to reread it today, starting with chapter 1. And I'm kidding. Oh my god, that's so awful. No, I'll just tell you right now that I don't make videos, so this is gonna be very awkward and uncomfortable for me, but hilarious for you. I don't even know where to look. I don't know if I look over there or over there. So hopefully I picked the right one. If not, you can laugh at me. Anyway, my name is Samantha, and I am gonna read to you chapter 1 from a book that I did write 4 years ago. It's called Ditching Mr. Darcy, and my nails are horrendous, so don't look at them. And I thought it would be really fun because I have not picked this up since then, since I wrote it. Like, I haven't reread it. I have this thing where I really can't reread anything that I've ever written, so I thought it'd be kind of funny to reread it together with the world. Because, you know, that's not a bad idea at all. First I have to show you the cover again because it's beautiful. And my beautiful friend and amazingly talented artist, Stacy Leonard, did the artwork for this, the front and back. I mean, seriously, it's gorgeous. And she has a website if you want to check it out. It's shopthisisart.com if you want to check out her artwork and buy some, because it's amazing. I actually have a painting, if you can see it in the corner, that she did as well. She's amazing and I love her. Anyway, so yeah, we're gonna read. I'm gonna read to you, and I read to my children every night, my youngest children, and so I'm very animated, so hopefully I can do this justice. And anyway, I think we'll just jump right in because I only have an hour until I have to pick up my kids from school, and it's not gonna be quiet in my house after that. So I'm probably gonna do about 1,000 takes of this, by the way, because I cannot speak words. They don't come out right of my mouth. So if there's 1,000 like cuts, that's why. Anyway, we are going to read one chapter together a week. This is going to happen for a while because there's a lot of chapters. And you guys can ask me questions or just comment, make fun of me, whatever you want to do. That's fine. So yeah, I'm going to start with chapter 1. And here we go. It was New Year's Eve. Softly falling snow slowly transformed the cars in the quiet street below into giant marshmallows. Sporadic partygoers trudged through the drifts in their evening wear, scrambling to deliver their champagne bottles before the midnight toast. Muffled laughter and music reverberated down the hallway of the building, the vibration from the speakers producing a steady humming that traveled through the narrow walls. Beyond the door labeled 10K in faded brass markers, there was little evidence of it being an extraordinary evening. The soft flicker of the television was the only source of light. It cast a ghostly sheen on everything in the room. An empty pint of Ben & Jerry's sat in a chocolate puddle next to a half-used box of Kleenex on the coffee table. Underneath a mountain of blankets and stray popcorn kernels, the sniffles of a young woman in a fraying but favorite pair of pajama pants could be heard over the background music of the movie she was watching for the 100th time. Elizabeth Baker could not remember ever feeling this miserable. What started as a potentially epic evening had gone down in proverbial flames, leaving her completely and utterly alone on her favorite night of the year. A few hours earlier, she had been sipping white wine at the best restaurant in town, wearing a black sequined mini dress in a room full of feverishly excited people awaiting midnight. The champagne was flowing, the leftover strings of Christmas lights were shimmering, and the live band was playing a spirited rendition of Uptown Funk as glamorous couples danced, their inhibitions lowered by drinks and end-of-holiday mania. Her feet tapped the floor to the rhythm as her hands anxiously knotted and unknotted her napkin. She swept her long auburn hair from her shoulders and glanced across the table at her boyfriend of 1 year, Brian. His eyes met hers. He flashed her one of his megawatt smiles that made her weak in the knees, and she knew. She just knew. This was it. He was going to propose, and of course she would say yes. She did love him. At least she was fairly sure she did. He very nearly met her criteria for the perfect man. But then again, no mere mortal could ever live up to her paradigm of manly perfection. There was only room for one on that pedestal, and had been ever since she turned 13 and unwrapped her most prized possession for her birthday, her first copy of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I have one somewhere. It was right here. Oh, mine's up there on the shelf. Anyway, it was then she was introduced to Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, and the bar was set for the next 14 years. Boyfriends came and went, and Elizabeth managed to find fault in all of them. After each breakup, she would go home and pull out her book, renewing her love affair with Mr. Darcy. It was only after she met Brian that her favorite book began to collect dust on her nightstand. 14 months earlier, Elizabeth had been invited to a Halloween party by a colleague at the food magazine where she worked as an editor. Naturally, she went as Elizabeth Bennet. Her costume consisted of a Regency-era gown, bonnet, and a not quite historically accurate Victoria's Secret corset, which constricted her breathing but gave her amazing cleavage, if she did say so herself. Her hair was swept up into a bun, with curls cascading around it, and her dramatic makeup made her green eyes pop. She felt beautiful and mysterious. That is, until she arrived, and it became immediately clear that somewhere along the line, Halloween had become a contest to see who could most effectively demoralize storybook characters with lingerie. She took a few unproductive laps around the room before cautiously joining a cluster of women deep in conversation, apple martinis in hand. She tried to look sincerely interested as she listened to Tina from marketing, dressed as the Easter Bunny with thigh-high stockings and garters, complain to Erica, Little Red Riding Hood with stilettos and fishnets, and Heather from finance. Elizabeth could only guess Winnie the Pooh from the red midriff top and yellow booty shorts, and felt her childhood might now be effectively ruined. About how her boss had found a copy of Cosmo on her desk lying open to an article entitled How to Seduce Your Boss, and was now worried he was getting the wrong idea. After a dramatic cry of outrage and a few enthusiastic gasps of false sympathy, Elizabeth turned to make her escape. As she wheeled around, she was stopped dead in her tracks by the incredible sight before her. If a person's life had a soundtrack, at this very moment, it could only be appropriate for At Last by Etta James to begin serenading her brain. Elizabeth watched awestruck as an absolutely gorgeous man in full Regency garb parted the crowd as if in slow motion and walked toward her. He wasn't tall. She guessed him to be only a few inches taller than her own height of 5'6". But he filled out his jacket nicely with his broad shoulders. His hair was chestnut brown and had that just rolled out of bed look, and his perfectly trimmed facial hair drew attention to his full lips. He had a swagger to his walk that seemed to suggest he knew exactly how charming he was. Honestly, she could hardly blame him, with those roguish sea-green eyes that almost sparkled when he smiled. And that smile! Elizabeth had never seen such an amazing smile in all her life. She couldn't seem to tear her eyes away from him. It was as though Mr. Darcy had strolled right out of the pages of her book and into the real world. She practically had to pick her chin up off the floor as he strolled past her and over to the bar. Like a moth to a flame, Elizabeth followed him, without a thought in her head as to what she would say when she got there. He turned to look at her as she stood gaping at him, and she froze. "What do you say to your fantasy come to life?" Luckily for her, the bartender snapped her out of her mannequin impression by asking her what she wanted. She ordered a glass of Chardonnay and turned back to see him eyeing her attire with a slight smirk. "Jane Austen?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She choked on her sip of wine. Elizabeth Bennet," she gasped. She gave him an awkward curtsy. "No kidding," he exclaimed, gesturing enthusiastically to his own costume. "I'm Mr. Darcy." "Yes, you sure are," she muttered provocatively, then covered her mouth when she realized she had said it out loud. What was that?" he asked, moving closer in order to hear her above the pandemonium. That's awesome," she cried. "I didn't think anyone here would have any clue who I was supposed to be, let alone come as another character from Pride and Prejudice. Are you a fan?" He smiled playfully and leaned in closer. "Actually, I wore this because I lost a bet, but I have seen the miniseries, and I'm not afraid to admit that I really enjoyed it." He cupped his hand around his mouth. "Plus, I'm not gonna lie, kind of like how I look in this getup." He winked and adjusted his cravat, then flipped his hat onto his head. Elizabeth felt a sort of premonition as she gazed adoringly at this top-hatted man with the most alluring smile. Could this possibly be the beginning of her happily ever after? She knew all too well she had a tendency to romanticize every relationship or chance encounter with the opposite sex. In the beginning, they all seemed to possess at least one of the major qualities on her checklist for the perfect man. In fact, she can almost envision them in breeches and a cravat, perhaps astride a horse, in the rain, down on one knee, professing eternal love and carrying her off to an estate somewhere in the country. Sigh. Unfortunately, her daydreams typically proved to be much more satisfying than reality. Her first serious boyfriend had been a lawyer in his late 20s. She was so proud of herself for finding a mature relationship as a senior in college. He had impeccable moral conduct. Or so Elizabeth thought, until his fiancée answered his phone and asked whether she was his current wife or his ex-wife. 2 months later, she met a pharmacist with a very impressive income. He also had an impressive amount of allergies, based on the number of boxes of decongestant he brought home from work on a regular basis. Elizabeth had just regretfully given away her cat to a friend when he called her from prison, having been arrested for running a meth lab in his elderly mother's basement. She could never look at Sudafed the same way again. Her most recent significant other, if you could even call him that, was a fellow editor at Flavor magazine. He had the dreamiest British accent. They flirted for almost a year before he finally summoned the courage to ask her out on a date. He apparently could not, however, summon the courage to tell her about his irritable bowel syndrome. After consuming copious amounts of Indian food at a restaurant featured in the latest edition, he drove her home. She said goodnight and leaned in to kiss him. Just before his lips reached hers, he whispered, "Would you mind if I used the loo?" Oh, I'm supposed to do it in an accent. Hang on. Oh my God, this is going to be a disaster. "Would you mind if I used the loo?" He then proceeded to annihilate the bathroom of her apartment. In an effort not to appear heartless, she went out with him a few more times, but seeing as she now found it difficult to make eye contact, it was obvious it was not meant to be. He did not handle their breakup well, and Elizabeth was only a little bit sorry that at work the following morning his desk was empty. It was not surprising that after the previous fiasco, Elizabeth stopped comparing 21st century men to Mr. Darcy. After all, Mr. Darcy would never cheat, sell illegal drugs, or defecate. But this time was different. This time she did not even have to imagine what he would look like in breeches and a cravat. Before her very eyes stood an actual Mr. Darcy in the flesh. It was more than a sign. It was as if fate itself was saying, "Elizabeth, I feel pretty bad about how I treated you before, so here's a freebie. Enjoy." She decided to make the most of it. "You look pretty amazing, that's for sure," she said, feeling her cheeks flush. "Well, thank you. You're a breath of fresh air yourself in a room like this." He cast a nauseated glare at the gaggle of women Elizabeth had just left. "My name is Brian Matthews. I work for Fairfax Publishing. Can I buy you another drink, Miss... Elizabeth. Elizabeth Baker," she replied, shaking his gloved hand. "I'm an editor at Flavor Magazine." She grinned. "And I would love one." A year of dating went by in a flash, and Elizabeth had just about made up her mind that he was as close to perfection as humanly possible. He was still flawlessly gorgeous. Each time he visited her at work, she was the envy of every one of her female colleagues. And funnily enough, a few of the men. He was serious yet sweet, thoughtful and considerate. He gave the best advice and the best foot massages. He loved reading. He had just finished the last of Jane Austen's novels. Cooking. He had every edition of Flavor Magazine alphabetized on a shelf in his kitchen. And shopping. He loved buying clothes for her almost as much as himself. And he had the best taste. They spent countless hours at the mall while her girlfriends were subjected to watching the Eagles game in dark and dirty bars. As a matter of fact, their mutual aversion for football was her favorite thing about him. Go Phillies! She really had only 2 complaints. Even though she had introduced him to the movie version of Pride and Prejudice, he insisted on watching the miniseries for reasons that were completely foreign to her. I have to preface this next section, by the way. I do not have a preference for the miniseries or the movie, one or the other. I love both. This was just the character's opinion, so don't be too hard on me, okay? This is like just a joke. Now that I'm seeing it, I'm remembering it, and I'm like, people did not like this at all, that I bashed this. So that's all I have to say about that. Anyway, it wasn't that she didn't like Colin Firth. She really did. And it wasn't that he wasn't good as Mr. Darcy. He was oh so yummy. It was that, in her opinion, Colin Firth was the only redemptive feature of the entire mind-numbing extravaganza. His best scene wasn't even in the book. It was only added to break up the excruciating monotony. The least they could have done would be to have him lose the wet shirt completely, so she really had something to look forward to. She had now seen it more times than she cared to admit, as it was the only film Brian became so engrossed in that he allowed her to snuggle with him while they watched it. Which brought her to the second complaint. Though the first few months of their relationship had been amazing, she had initiated most of their displays of affection. The longer they were together, the less he seemed attracted to her physically. She really couldn't account for it, other than his possibly taking the whole Mr. Darcy thing to the next level and honoring the Regency rules of propriety that made physical contact practically non-existent. Yeah, that had to be it. It was either that or her love of pizza and ice cream was finally coming back to bite her in her apparently burgeoning backside. Looking over her shoulder in the mirror, she didn't think it was any larger than usual. But even if it was getting a little bit bigger, didn't most guys typically like that? There were countless songs dedicated to how much they liked it, weren't there? Well, if her personal Mr. Darcy didn't agree with Sir Mix-a-Lot, then she would hit the Stairmaster and cease and desist on her weekly pizza deliveries. After all, if he was obviously making an attempt to become her fantasy, then the least she could do would be to become his. And besides, everything would work itself out once they were married. So there they were, New Year's Eve, at the best restaurant in town, drinking wine and enjoying the holiday excitement. Elizabeth smoothed her skirt and smiled nervously at Brian, who smiled fleetingly back at her. This is it. Everything about the evening had been perfect so far, and now it seemed the rest of her life would be. She casually placed her left hand on the table to make it more accessible for him. After a moment, he reached over and held it in both his hands as he began slowly. "Elizabeth?" "Yes," she replied softly, her heart beating against her ribs like a caged animal. "I have something I need to tell you." He swallowed hard. "Yes?" she asked again, a little more urgently. "Well, it's something I should have told you a long time ago, but the timing never felt right, and I wasn't sure exactly how to do it." Elizabeth could hardly contain her excitement. Here we go! Elizabeth, I'm in love. He looked almost ashamed. I know, she replied dreamily. Me too. Her eyes began searching for the location of the ring. Could it be in the dessert? No, not with you. With someone else. He looked down at their hands and cringed. It took a few seconds for her to register what he said. Suddenly, the music stopped. Everyone in the restaurant disappeared. The silence was deafening. It seemed as if the very air had been sucked out of the room as she stared blankly at him without blinking. 2 horrifyingly uncomfortable minutes later, she was still staring. What? She finally managed to whisper. I'm so very sorry. I should have told you long ago. I just didn't want to hurt you. He gave her a sympathetic look. But he really is quite amazing. I would love for you to meet him. Elizabeth realized she hadn't inhaled for almost a minute as her lungs screamed for oxygen. She gasped and choked as she croaked out, He? Yes, his name is James. But you're gay? The couple at the table next to them looked up from their meals. Well, yes, I suppose so. Yes, I am. He grimaced as he waited for her reaction. I thought you were going to propose to me tonight. Elizabeth stared at him, aghast. Oh, Lizzie, no. He looked at her with pity in his gaze. I needed to tell you the truth, and I didn't want to wait any longer. I didn't want you to be misled any longer. Don't you Lizzie me, she hissed. I cannot believe this. All this time we were together, you were in love with another man? The couple were now staring shamelessly in their direction. Well, actually, in my defense, I didn't even speak on the phone with him until a few months ago. And nothing has happened beyond meeting for coffee a few times a week, I promise you. Brian waited for her response, but none came, so he continued. We were co-workers until he moved to Chicago 3 years ago, and we lost touch. But when he came to town on business and called to see if I wanted to meet up, well, we reconnected, you see. I would have told you then, but I was still unsure myself, and when I finally realized how I felt, I could never find a way to do it. I do love you, Lizzie. You are the best friend I've ever had, and I couldn't imagine losing your friendship. It just seemed so much easier to keep things the way they were until I could figure out how to tell you that I wasn't in love with you. Let me get this straight. Elizabeth's voice was decidedly calm, though her knuckles were white on her clenched napkin. You realized you were in love with someone else, but you didn't tell me because you didn't want to lose me as a friend? She let go of the napkin and clutched the end of the table with both hands. I can't even believe this right now. I thought you were in love with me. This is insane. In love with a man. I never would have believed it. She trailed off as she sat back in her seat and fell silent again. She could feel her anger subside into resignation. She muttered quietly, I think I knew. What? Brian asked, leaning forward to hear her. I think I knew you were gay. She met his gaze with Herculean effort. I mean, I didn't really know until now, but looking back, it was just so obvious. What do you mean? He frowned. Even I didn't know for sure until a few months ago. Well, first of all, she began, her smile slightly manic. For the last few months or so, probably around the time you reconnected with James, you've hardly even touched me. I thought maybe there was something wrong with me. To think I ate kale shakes to drop a few pounds because I worried maybe you didn't find me attractive anymore. I gave up ice cream for you. The sheer irony of it all is just so... Elizabeth grimaced. So, all those times you said you were at the gym? Oh dear God. Did you mean J-I-M? Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat and glanced at the nearest table again. The woman was giving him the stink eye and shaking her head back and forth slowly. Elizabeth, please don't say that so loud. And what about all those shopping trips where you helped me pick out clothes based on my body type? Straight men think that just means male or female. Now that everything was becoming clear, it was just embarrassing, really. All those times that we took turns trying on outfits and modeling them for each other? Boyfriends don't do that. Girlfriends do. For that matter, even my girlfriends don't enjoy shopping as much as you do. Brian, your closet looks like the men's department at Ralph Lauren. It was apparent that she was finding her stride, and Brian looked truly sorry that he had chosen a public location to break the news. The couple to the other side were snickering into their napkins, while the woman closest to them muttered, "Bastard," under her breath. Oh, and the icing on the fruitcake. How about all the times we watched your DVD of Pride and Prejudice? Whoa, whoa, whoa. You love Pride and Prejudice. You can't possibly say that was all my idea, Brian interjected. You know darn well I would not voluntarily watch the miniseries, Elizabeth hissed. And I suppose you're pausing and replaying the wet shirt scene because it was the best part? Was my idea as well? The man on the right snorted and choked on his wine. Brian fell silent, defeated. They simply sat and stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, Elizabeth sighed as she looked at the happy couples around her. It's okay. Really, I'm happy for you. I suppose that you found your soulmate, and maybe a little jealous. I know what you mean when you say you love me, but that you aren't in love with me. I don't think I was ever really in love with you either, even if you are the most gorgeous man I have ever seen. Well, besides Jude Law. She gave a short laugh. I mean, you don't even like baseball. Forget about being gay. Isn't liking baseball sort of a prerequisite to being an American? Seeing the wounded look on his face, she decided to change the subject. So, what is James like? Brian's knitted eyebrows instantly unraveled into one of his devastating smiles, and Elizabeth felt that familiar flutter somewhere in her midsection. Man, I'm gonna miss that. He's amazing. Tall, dark, and handsome. A lawyer for the government. He has a penthouse apartment and a country home in London. He lived in the UK his entire life until he came to the States for college. And oh, you would love this, Lizzie. He is a distant relative of the Duke of Devonshire who owns the Chatsworth House. It was Pemberley in the movie version. He gave her a sheepish grin. Although he happens to prefer the miniseries like myself, especially the wet shirt scene. Oh, for crying out loud. An hour later, Elizabeth closed the door to her apartment. She kicked off her heels one at a time and made her way to the bedroom to change, stopping at the refrigerator to grab some fish food and a spoon. No reason to postpone the inevitable. It's not like it matters how big my butt gets now. Sinking into the couch cushions and bearing herself up to her neck in blankets, she turned on the television and pressed play on the DVD player. She sighed as the music began and the words Pride and Prejudice filled the screen. It was so strange to be watching it all alone. With a small sob, she realized that she would probably be alone for the rest of her life. Suddenly, the crowd in the apartment above her began a thunderous countdown to midnight. Elizabeth joined in half-heartedly under her breath. 3, 2, 1. She felt the ceiling rumble with the tumultuous cry of "Happy New Year!" and fell face first into a pillow. She thought sadly of all the kisses that were being given above her and everywhere at that moment. "Happy New Year," she muttered sadly to herself before stuffing tissues in her ears and falling asleep. That was chapter 1. So next week, we'll continue with chapter 2. Hopefully, it wasn't so bad. And yeah, if you have any questions, send them my way. Or comments, or I don't know, anything at all. Just to make me feel like I'm not a complete loser for doing this. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.